This is no ordinary story. There are 3 possible outcomes. After the 2nd chapter, the path to defeat begins. After the 4th, there is an alternative with a heavy price. And in the finale, there is a rare case where the idea prevails after all. What happens when an unknown engineer from the front lines challenges the Soviet Union's armored vehicle doctrine? His design was ridiculed, the tank was dismantled, and he was sent to a penal colony. But a year later, the entire army was raiding on his idea, and no one knew his name. Southeast of Oriel, June 1943. The sun beat down hard on the field depot near the Sukaya Orlitsa River. Dust clung to everything, boots, bolts, brows. Engines roared in the distance like distant thunder, and in the middle of it all, Lieutenant Mikhail Baklanov stood shirt-sleeved, covered in grease, cutting into the rusted chassis of a burned-out T-34. "See the weld here," he said, pointing with his wrench. "Straight seam, factory spec. But if you angle it, reinforce it here." The junior tech beside him looked nervous. "That's not in the manual, sir." Mikhail didn't even blink. Neither was the way they died inside it. The tech fell silent. Baklanov was no traditional officer. He wasn't even a real soldier, depending on who you asked. Before the war, he was a mechanical engineer teaching in Tomsk. He volunteered in 41, patched tanks at Kharkov, crawled out of wreckage with a dislocated shoulder, and never went home. Not because he had to, because he knew it could be done better. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who couldn't stand watching steel fail where it should have held. The good kind of trouble. That week, rumors were everywhere. German armor was on the move. Something big was coming near Kursk. The Soviets were digging in, but Mikhail was building. He gathered a crew, 2 mechanics, a welder, and a draftsman who could draw blueprints on the back of ammo crates. "We're redesigning the frontal armor," Mikhail said. "No approval, no paperwork, just results." One of them, a veteran with burn scars up his neck, spat on the ground. "They'll hang us if we mess this up." Mikhail looked him in the eye. "Then let's make sure we don't." They started at night. No lights, just torches, and the orange-blue glow of sparks off steel. Welding plates at new angles, reinforcing internal seams, stripping parts off wrecks, bending Soviet standards until they bent with them. A tank shell wasn't poetry. It was math and pressure and lives. Mikhail understood all 3. By dawn on the 3rd day, they had something new. Still a T-34, technically, but leaner, meaner, sharper, a knife instead of a hammer. That morning, a black Zayas staff car pulled up. The system response Colonel Grishin stepped out in a crisp uniform, flanked by aides with clipboards and frowns. He didn't shake hands. "I assume you're Lieutenant Baklanov." Mikhail stood straight. "Yes, sir." Grishin didn't look at the tank. He looked at the file. "This experiment. You did this without authorization?" "Yes, sir. I improved the armor angles, welded cross-reinforcement, reduced dead weight by—" "You modified a state design. That's a direct violation of protocols." Mikhail held his ground. "We made it safer." Grishin sighed, as if he'd heard this 1,000 times. "Lieutenant, this isn't a university. You don't improvise war machines. The state has engineers for that." "I am an engineer." Grishin paused, as if only now realizing it wasn't just idealism. This man actually believed in what he was saying. "Effective immediately. You're relieved of your post," he said, flipping the folder shut. "Your prototype will be disassembled. Report to Frontline Repair, Detail 42. "Sir, that's an order." "Thrown to the wolves." The next morning, Mikhail was hauling broken gearboxes in a forward zone trench depot barely 50 kilometers from the front. The air was metal and mud. Mortars thumped in the distance. His new commanding officer didn't ask questions, just pointed. "Fix what's broken. Don't speak unless spoken to. No drafting tools, no blueprints, no team. Just fire, scrap, and silence." He kept working. He drew redesigns on ration wrappers, scratched out pressure diagrams on crate lids. Anything to keep thinking. Anything to avoid the numb weight of knowing the machine didn't just reject him, it spit him out. One night, as he was refitting a turret ring by lamplight, a tank crew returned from the front. The commander's leg was wrapped in a torn shirt. 2 men dead. The driver's face was burned black. Mikhail stared at the twisted wreck of their T-34. Clean hit. Frontal shot. The armor had folded exactly where he'd warned it would. He didn't sleep that night. One against a wall, days passed. Weeks, maybe. He didn't count. Then one afternoon, Sergeant Yakovenko, an old mechanic with frostbitten fingers and no patience for dreams, pulled up a folding chair. "You really think your design would have helped?" he asked. "I know it would have." Then why didn't they listen? Mikhail didn't answer right away. "Because I didn't come from the right academy. Because I never wore a general's boots. Because I told the truth at the wrong time." Yakovenko nodded slowly. "You've got fire, engineer. Just don't burn yourself alive with it." The silence. After Genius, 1 week before the German assault launched near Kursk, the prototype was gone. Scrapped, welded down to plates for other tanks. The report on Mikhail's project was filed, sealed, ignored. In official logs, nothing happened. No mention of a civilian-born lieutenant who tried to rethink Soviet armor. No acknowledgement of a design that could have saved lives. No idea that the system, fearing chaos more than failure, quietly buried something that could have mattered. July 5th, 1943. Eastern Front, south of Kursk. Before the sun rose, the sky was already boiling. Artillery lit up the horizon like a broken sunrise. The German offensive, Operation Citadel, was underway. Thousands of tanks grinding across the steppe. Tiger Eyes and Panthers in the vanguard. Their 88mm guns cut through air, steel, and men like they were made of the same thing. In the grass outside a village called Cherkaskoy, the 162nd Tank Brigade was preparing to counterattack. 30 T-34s, all factory standard, all with the same armor profiles, all with the same weak points Mikhail Baklanov had redesigned 2 weeks earlier. He wasn't with them. He was 60 kilometers east, in a front-line repair yard, replacing the shattered gearbox of a tank that would never run again. Steel meets reality. By midday, the reports started arriving. Platoons overrun, losses at 40%. Turrets blown clean off hulls. German shells punching through like the armor wasn't even there. At dusk, the trucks began showing up. Not tanks. Bodies. Men wrapped in tarps, soot-blackened and bent at impossible angles. Drivers, gunners, engineers, young, silent. Mikhail stared at the first truck as it rolled in. His hands were black with grease. His heart was colder than his tools. He didn't speak, but he knew. No one to blame. No one to listen. He tried again. He wrote a report. Short, precise. Titled it, "Observed Patterns in Frontal Armor Failures During German Assault, Preliminary Analysis." He attached hand-drawn sketches, shell angles, failure zones, suggested counter-modifications. He handed it to a logistics officer passing through from brigade command. The officer didn't even unfold the pages, just looked at the title and shook his head. "This isn't your lane, comrade. It's men's lives. It's not protocol." And that was it. System failure, human cost. By July 8th, estimates put Soviet tank losses near 1,500. German shells were doing exactly what Baklanov predicted, hitting at the same angles, piercing the same seams. Some tanks exploded, some burned. Most just stopped moving, with crews still inside. The worst part, nobody changed anything. There wasn't time. The machine kept turning. Supply chains couldn't pivot. Factories couldn't retool. Command couldn't admit it missed something, especially from a sideline lieutenant with no star on his shoulder. Baklanov's prototype design wasn't just ignored. It was buried. And with it, the chance to mitigate the worst week of tank losses the Red Army would suffer in the war. The moment it broke. On July 10th, a T-34 limped into the yard with its front plate sheared open like a tin can. Inside was a boy. He couldn't have been older than 19, maybe 18. His face was red with blood and powder. He wasn't crying, just staring. Mikhail helped lift him out, carried him to the med tent. "Can you hear me?" he asked. The boy blinked. "Why didn't they fix the armor?" he whispered. That night, Mikhail walked out to the edge of camp and sat in the dust. He said nothing, not because he had no words left, but because there was no one left to hear them. The collapse. A week later, Baklanov was rotated out. No honors, no debriefs. Just a stamp, a train ride, and a quiet return to a supply base in Bryansk. Reassigned to parts inspection. They told him it was because of excellent technical performance under pressure. But he knew the truth. They needed him quiet. Needed the ghost of his idea to stay buried under paperwork and burnt metal. In the depot, he met other engineers, men who'd once tried to improve radio shielding, refine fuel systems, rework gear ratios. All shut down, all sidelined, all swallowed by the same machine. Some drank, some faded. Mikhail stayed quiet, worked, waited. But the fire in him, the one that wanted to make it better, it was dying, and he could feel it. The myth that never was when the Battle of Kursk ended, the Soviet Union called it a victory. They weren't wrong, but the cost, the real cost, never made the headlines. Thousands dead in tanks that could have been stronger. Ideas that might have saved them, written in grease and blood, erased before they reached a desk. Mikhail Baklanov watched it all from behind a chain-link fence, at a depot that never asked questions. He wasn't court-martialed. He wasn't arrested. He was just erased. Not a traitor, not a hero. Just a man with a better idea, left behind because the system feared disruption more than it feared defeat. What happens when the system wins? This. Not a scandal, not a speech. Just silence and empty tanks cooling in the sun. But what if things had turned out a little differently? What if one meeting, one person, one attempt could have changed everything? Here begins the second version of events. A compromise, but not without losses. If you are intrigued by the idea of how one unmade decision could have changed the course of history, please support the project. Subscribe so you don't miss out on other alternative scenarios of World War II. And in the comments tell us, which turn of events do you think is most likely? And how would you like to see the world? Late July 1943. Bryansk Depot, rear logistics zone. Mikhail Baklanov sat behind a long wooden workbench, inspecting transmission gears that would never see battle. Dust caked the floor. The air was too quiet. Punishment quiet. The kind that tells you you're out of the game and no one's asking why. He hadn't spoken to anyone about armor redesigns in weeks. Not since Kursk. Not since the bodies came back. Not since the boy with blood on his face whispered, "Why didn't they fix it?" He kept his head down, marked the parts, kept the ghost of his idea folded inside his breast pocket, scratched onto a single worn blueprint. It was all he had left of that moment, when it almost meant something. Then one afternoon, the wall cracked. The colonel from nowhere. It started with a surprise visit. A convoy from the Central Tank Directorate pulled up to the depot unannounced. In the lead jeep, a short, square-jawed officer stepped out, brushing dust from his jacket. Colonel Zinchenko. Rumors said he'd just returned from the Southern Front. Unlike most staff men, he had soot on his sleeves and burn scars across his knuckles. He walked the depot fast, asked sharp questions, and listened harder than any officer Mikhail had seen. Then, as he passed Mikhail's bench, something strange happened. He stopped, picked up one of the test components. "Where'd you learn this type of cut?" Mikhail looked up, cautious. "Adapted it. During front repairs. Reduces vibration stress by 15%. Not standard." Zinchenko nodded slowly. "You ever do field mods?" Mikhail hesitated. "I did." Zinchenko leaned in. "Show me." A second chance. In a corner of the depot, behind 2 crates and a broken axle, Mikhail unrolled the blueprint. The last one. The only one. Sloped armor angles, reinforced welds, modified frame curvature. Zinchenko didn't say anything for a full minute. Then he muttered, almost to himself. This could have helped at Cherkaskoye. Mikhail didn't respond. Why was it never implemented? No approval, Mikhail said. No rank, no stamp. Zinchenko stood straight. He looked at Mikhail like a man seeing something buried too long. "I'm heading to Gorky next week. Tank factory. I need someone who's not afraid to think." He tapped the blueprint. "Bring this, quietly." Into the belly of industry, Gorky tank plant. Number 92 was a beast. Noise, heat, sparks. Rows of T-34s lined up like iron ghosts waiting to be born. Engineers shouted over the clatter of drills. Women in oil-stained overalls moved like clockwork between machines. It wasn't a factory. It was a front line of its own. Zinchenko introduced Mikhail as a consultant. No one asked what that meant, but the chief engineer, Komarov, tall, proud, clean gloves, clearly didn't like it. "A civilian," he muttered, "with ideas." Mikhail ignored the jab. He unpacked his drawings, stood in front of the plant's design team, and presented his redesign. Clean, direct, numbers sharp, curves exact. No slogans, just data. There was a long silence afterward. Then Komarov scoffed. "This isn't how we do things. Our chassis has been validated in trials." "And in graves," Mikhail said before he could stop himself. The room froze. Zinchenko didn't intervene. He just let the silence stretch until another engineer, a woman named Rudneva, finally stepped forward. "What if we tested just one?" The prototype that wasn't supposed to exist. They built it in secret. Unofficially, it was Model T-34B1. Internally, they called it the Ghost. It used Mikhail's design. Sloped armor, internally braced plating, lower silhouette, reinforced hatches. One machine. No fanfare. On August 18th, they rolled it out to the test range under overcast skies. 2 test crews stood by. The gun was real. The armor, untested. 3 hours of field trials, direct hits with AP rounds, no penetrations. 0 crew loss. At dusk, Zinchenko looked at the data, folded the reports, and said simply, "We move forward." The political cost. But not everyone agreed. News of the test leaked to Moscow. 3 days later, Komarov was summoned. He returned with orders. Suspend all unapproved prototypes. Engineering Bureau must revalidate, resubmit, recycle. The old hands clapped. Protocol had won. Zinchenko stared at the paper like it was a death certificate. Mikhail didn't sleep that night. He sat in the factory dorm, staring at his boots, thinking about going home, about quitting. But just before dawn, Rudneva knocked on his door. They're delaying, not canceling. That means they're scared. He looked at her. So we push harder. The back door. It was Zinchenko who found the loophole. Instead of resubmitting to the Central Bureau, he rerouted the data through the Leningrad Front's engineering office, one of the few divisions allowed to implement emergency field modifications. It wasn't legal, but it wasn't technically illegal either. By September, limited production began. Off the books. 12 units. Then 24, painted in factory gray, sent north. Deployed in silence. Nobody talked about it, but the idea was no longer dead. It was moving. Slowly. Through gears, hands, and orders scribbled in pencil. Sometimes the system doesn't break. It just flinches long enough for something new to slip in. Mikhail Baklanov's idea wasn't celebrated. It wasn't approved, but it was alive. Northern Front, September 1943. Outskirts of Maga near Leningrad. The snow came early that year. Not heavy, just enough to blur the edges of the trenches, to make the ground crackle under boots. The men of the 8th Guards Tank Regiment weren't thinking about prototypes or armor angles. They were thinking about food, about warmth, about how many of them wouldn't make it through the next offensive. But when the new tanks arrived, they noticed. The hatches felt heavier. The sloped plating looked strange. One mechanic ran his hand along the reinforced seam and muttered, "She breathes different." There were no manuals, no briefings, just orders. Drive, fight, report. No one told them this wasn't the standard T-34, and no one told them the man who'd redesigned it had been nearly erased for doing so. First contact, September 23rd. The Germans launched a counter-assault northeast of Sinyavino. Fog, mud, frozen ditches. 8 Soviet tanks rolled into the woods to intercept. 3 were Model B-1s. Only the B-1s came back. One of the returning crews, led by Sergeant Alexei Miroshkin, climbed out shaking. Not from fear, from disbelief. "We took 3 direct hits," he said, wiping ash from his face. "Front plate, 0 penetration." The field commander didn't believe it. Had the tank re-examined. No damage to the crew compartment, just scorched paint. They sent the report to Leningrad HQ the next day. The telegram that changed nothing 2 days later, in Gorky. Mikhail Baklanov stood alone in the corner of a tool room, rereading the telegram. Field trial of B-1 variant under combat conditions successful. No penetrations. Full crew survival. Recommendation, evaluate for wider use. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He folded the telegram in half and put it in his pocket. A part of him wanted to scream. They finally listened. But another part remembered the trucks filled with burned-out tanks. Remembered how many crews had died, waiting for someone to take a risk. Too late. The prototype had worked, but not when it mattered most. Recognition without celebration. A week later, Zinchenko invited him into a meeting room lined with charts, blueprints, and tired men. "They're authorizing limited production," he said, "under the name T-34B. You'll get citation credit in the engineering logs. That's all we can promise." Mikhail nodded. "Am I allowed to speak about it?" Zinchenko shook his head. "It's not that kind of victory." Komarov, the chief engineer who once dismissed him, sat at the far end of the table. He didn't look at Mikhail, but when the meeting ended, he lingered near the door. "You were right," he said quietly, not turning around. "We all knew it. We just weren't ready." Mikhail didn't answer. What was there to say? Ghost machines in real battles. By November, small batches of T-34B tanks were entering frontline service under the guise of field-adapted variants. No press releases, no photos, just reports, fewer crew casualties, longer operational lifespan, better survival against German anti-tank rounds. But there was no rush to overhaul production lines. Factories were overburdened, standards had inertia, and Moscow wasn't eager to admit that a sidelined engineer had seen what entire design committees had missed. Instead of a breakthrough, Mikhail got a compromise, a partial win, paid for in full by others. The survivor's guilt of ideas. In quiet moments, Mikhail walked the plant alone, watching other tanks roll off the line. He could see where the armor would fail. He could trace the weak points with his eyes. But they weren't his to fix anymore. One night, in the cafeteria, Rudneva sat beside him with a mug of tea. "They're using your work," she said. "People are alive because of it." Mikhail nodded. "And how many died because they weren't ready in time?" She didn't answer. She just stared ahead. That was the question none of them could ever stop asking. The man they didn't know they owed. In January 1944, a T-34B tank was photographed near the Finnish front after surviving a direct hit from a German 88-meter. The crew sent a note to Central Command. "We don't know who designed this tank, but whoever they are, they saved us. We owe them our lives." The note was archived. It never reached Mikhail. No ceremony, no medals, just silent validation, written in oil and steel and breath still inside lungs. That was his reward. The war moved on and didn't bury him this time. Success, on paper, survival, in steel. But for Mikhail Baklanov, there was no closure, only the silence of what could have been. Not failure, not glory, just a partial redemption paid in scars. But there is a third way, when the system can no longer stop an idea. Next is the story of how resistance becomes reform. March 1944, Gorky Tank Plant. Number 92, Design Wing, Bay 4. The frost was still thick outside, but inside Bay 4, something was heating up. The unofficial nickname for it was the Furnace, not because of temperature, but because of what it did to ideas. Engineers came in, pitched the impossible, and either got burned or came out hardened. And today, the Furnace was burning red-hot with the question, what if we built a T-34 that didn't follow the doctrine? Mikhail Baklanov stood at the drafting table, sleeves rolled, knuckles stained with graphite. Around him, 5 other engineers, none of them senior, none of them cleared, were arguing over turret rotation speeds, internal ammunition layout, and armor modularity. Rudneva, the factory's most fearless systems engineer, slammed a wrench on the table. "We've been playing catch-up since 1942, she snapped. "Why are we still pretending these designs are sacred?" Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. They weren't just building a tank anymore. They were building a rebellion made of bolts and steel. The turning point. It started with an order, then a refusal. The Central Bureau issued new specs for incremental upgrades to the standard T-34. Slight improvements to radio shielding, an updated scope, a new track model. Baklanov read the document in silence, then pushed it aside. "We're not doing that." Someone laughed nervously. "You want to get reassigned again?" "No," Mikhail said calmly. "I want to win." Zinchenko backed him, fully, openly. "I've seen what bureaucracy costs. I'm done watching smart people get buried under blue ink and bad habits." And just like that, they stopped asking. Breaking the rules by building better. They gutted an old T-34 hull and started from scratch. New frontal slope based on Baklanov's curve deflection theory. Reinforced turret ring, reducing decapitations under impact. Low-profile cupola, improving visibility while reducing silhouette. Reworked internal fuel lines, cutting fire risk by 40%. Every change violated some regulation. Every bolt tightened without permission. They documented nothing officially. Instead, they wrote on chalkboards, took photos with personal cameras, hid parts under tops and fake maintenance requests. Word spread. Ammunition handlers came by to watch. Factory welders offered better metal cuts off the books. Tank crews on rotation asked, "When can we drive that?" The Grey Battalion. By May 1944, they had 4 units. They weren't listed on any official rolls, no serial numbers, no registry. Internally, they were known as the Grey Battalion, named after the primer they were painted in, unfinished, unapproved. They were tested in late-night runs through frozen ravines, crews hand-picked by Zinchenko himself. Not the loud ones, the good ones, the ones who knew machines like they were brothers. On June 1st, one of the Grey tanks survived a direct ambush by 3 German Pak-40 crews. The crew climbed out laughing. One of them turned to Mikhail, who was observing from a hill, and shouted, "This thing eats shells and asks for seconds." They started calling it the Iron Wolf. From whispers to roars, everything changed when photos leaked. A journalist embedded with the tank division saw one of the Iron Wolves in action near Vitebsk. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it wasn't standard. He snapped 2 blurry photos and wrote a line in his dispatch. "Some of our boys are riding beasts I've never seen before, and they don't break." The story was censored before it reached the press, but not before it hit the desk of a general in the Red Army's Armored Command. Within a week, inspectors were sent to Gorky. But by then, the plant workers had done something unthinkable. They marched the 4 Grey Battalion tanks into the main yard during shift change and started a public demonstration, right in front of the visiting officers. Mikhail stepped forward, dirty, unshaven, furious. "No secrets," he said, "just better engineering." He turned, slapped the side of the tank, and nodded to the crew. They started the engine, loud, proud, invincible. The confrontation Komarov, the old chief engineer, stood stone-faced next to the inspectors. "You violated at least 10 military codes," he muttered to Mikhail. "This isn't how change happens." "No," Mikhail replied. "This is how it survives." Rudneva stepped in. "You had your chance to lead," she said. "Now get out of the way." There was no vote, no decree. But after that day, Komarov never returned to Bay 4. Permission. Finally granted, weeks later, a formal order arrived. Effective immediately, T-34B modification approved for adaptive deployment on eligible fronts. Production authorization granted to Gorky plant. No. 92 under revised field integration model. No apology, no credit. But also, no more resistance. Baklanov read the order, folded it. Then, for the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe. They had done it. Not with metals, with steel. This was the chapter where silence ended, where an engineer became louder than a doctrine, where the machine, finally, flinched. Not because it wanted to, because it had no other choice. Victory isn't just what you win on the battlefield, it's what remains after the smoke clears. Sometimes the loudest legacy is built in silence, welded into machines, carried forward by those who remember. This is how the war changed, not all at once, but one blueprint at a time. July 1944, Eastern Poland. The forests burned with artillery fire. The Soviet advance was moving fast. Too fast, some said. Roads barely held under the weight of the retreating Wehrmacht and surging Red Army columns. Bridges cracked, villages emptied, and armored divisions roared west through fields that had never known this much iron. Leading the tip of one such spearhead was the 19th Guards Tank Regiment. Their formation wasn't standard. At the front rolled 6 T-34B Iron Wolf variants, gray steel turned gunmetal by soot and rain, their hulls marked with kill rings hastily chalked by proud, exhausted hands. In one of them, Sergeant Miroshkin squinted through the viewport and smirked. "Feels like we're finally the ones with the better machines," he muttered, one hand on the throttle. He wasn't wrong. When the steel hits back. That morning, near a crossroads outside Lublin, the column met its first real resistance in weeks. A German Panzerkampfgruppe had dug in. Panthers, assault guns, 2 88-meter flaks. The terrain was a death trap. Open fields, no cover, perfect for ambush. But Miroshkin didn't wait. "Push through," he barked. "We're not built to stop." The Iron Wolves advanced into fire, formation tight, shells screaming past them. A Panther scored a direct hit on the lead tank's frontal plate. The crew inside shouted but didn't flinch. No breach. Another shell hit the side. It sparked, gouged steel, but didn't punch through. "Still with me?" Miroshkin called over the radio. His driver laughed. All day they surged forward. The turning point in doctrine hours later, the after-action report from Lublin crossed the desk of General Orlov, newly promoted and overseeing armored strategy in the western sectors. He read the following. Observed. T-34B prototypes engaged in high-risk frontal advance under sustained fire. Losses, 0. Penetrations, 0. Enemy armor neutralized. Suggest full incorporation into all mechanized regiments. He underlined one word. Full. For the first time in the war, field results changed doctrine in real time. Within weeks, orders were issued. T-34B line approved for extended production frontline engineering teams to incorporate B-1 pattern as standard design credits logged under Baklanov, M, Rudneva, A, Zinchenko, V. The recognition that almost wasn't in Gorky, the factory erupted with motion. The gray battalion tanks were no longer hidden. They were now the template. Mikhail stood in Bay 4, watching as assembly lines retooled not just to reproduce his design, but to refine it. Young engineers asked him questions. Welders brought him coffee. A few even saluted him in the hallway. One day, a major from the frontline press corps showed up. "We're doing a feature," he said. "On the T-34B. You'll be in it." Mikhail blinked. "I'm not interested in being famous." "Doesn't matter," the major said, smiling. "You're already a myth." The system shifts. Even Komarov returned, quietly, not as chief, but as a consultant. He walked the line with care, nodding at changes he once rejected. Mikhail approached him during a break. "You here to say I told you so?" Komarov asked, not looking up. "No," Mikhail replied. "I'm here to say thank you for stepping aside when it mattered." The old man nodded. For a long time nothing else was said. Some battles end in noise, others end in silence that means something. Legacy in motion. By winter, the Iron Wolf chassis was on every front. Poland, Hungary, Romania. Losses dropped. Survivability rates climbed. Crews started calling them the tanks that brought you home. In a letter to his old university in Tomsk, Mikhail wrote, "I didn't set out to build a better tank. I set out to stop the wrong men from dying in the wrong machines. The rest just followed." One final scene. May 1945. Berlin falls. T-34Bs roll through rubble streets, their gray plates scarred but intact. Miroshkin climbs out of his tank and lights a cigarette. His gunner nods at the busted turret beside them. "She held," he says. "Yeah," Miroshkin replies. "Someone built her like they gave a damn." What remains? After the war, Mikhail refused a high office. He went back to teaching. In quiet classrooms, he told new students about flow dynamics, metallurgical stress, and the importance of asking questions that make people uncomfortable. Rudneva took over Bay 4. Zinchenko went into policy, quietly pushed reforms that made sure no field engineer would ever again be punished for being right too soon. And in every museum that displayed a T-34, one plate bore a small inscription, etched by a welder, not a general. This tank design was born not in the halls of command, but in the hands of those who refused to look away. Victory didn't look like a parade. It looked like fewer funerals, like ideas surviving where people almost didn't. And in the end, the Iron Wolf didn't just change battles. It changed who had the right to be heard,